Loop makers and sample makers are becoming more relevant nowadays than ever before. So in this video, I'm going to show you guys how to use Arturia's plugins to sound design for your loops and your melodies. So sound design is a critical skill to have if you guys are going to dedicate your sound for being a sample maker or a loop maker, because you have to understand how to tweak sounds. Okay, whereas a beat maker can kind of use presets and kind of keep it moving. So here we have the Prophet 5. So if you guys want to see a specific synth from Arturia, let me know in the comments below. We're going to start here with the Prophet 5 because it covers a lot of, the synth realm. So firstly, let's click up top. Let's go down to where it says template. Let's reset this back to default, which will give us that's a piano, okay, which will give us a sawtooth sound, okay? So the sawtooth is going to be your main utility sound, where it just kind of covers a wide range of uses. Okay, so we'll program some stuff in. So let's start with chordal information. Okay, let's start by building a chord first. My favorite thing to do is before I start sound designing, I'll write the music first, because I want to hear my sound in the context, in real world context. So let's write a minor chord. Let's copy these over. Let's take that minor third, drop it down, and make it suspended second. So this is what I usually do because it gives you the vibe of the sound. It helps me to understand how the sound deals with friction and dissonance. So the first thing to understand are the sound generating things. Those are called oscillators. Okay, so oscillators, there's oscillator 1 and oscillator 2. Let me see if I can make this a little bit bigger for those at home. So we have oscillator 1 and oscillator 2. Oscillators generate the sound. Okay, so these are the sound sources. So by default, oscillator 2 is not turned on. We have this thing called a mixer. And the mixer either turns oscillator 1 up, oscillator 2 up or down, and turns the noise oscillation up or down. So by default, it's set to not have oscillator 2 turned on. So before we start messing with this whole category of stuff here, let's work with oscillator 1. So the frequency area is where we determine the semitone values of the sound. So if I pull these up one by one, this will pull the notes up one by one. So it's a quick way to shift octaves, which is 12 semitones, go down an octave, negative 12 semitones, or any interval in between. Okay, so that's where we just kind of adjust the fine tuning of something. Now, nextly, we have the shape type. We have a sawtooth, which is this pointy shape, which is very bitey, like a tooth. So that's called a sawtooth. It's very bitey. And then you have a square wave or pulse wave, which is more video game sounding. And we can combine those two waveforms. So let me play each. Here's the sawtooth. Now let's switch over to the pulse wave. Now let's combine the two. The sound becomes a little more noisy because now we have what are called even harmonics mixed with odd harmonics, and it creates a noisier sound to have that sawtooth and pulse wave together. In short, sawtooth uses even harmonics. You don't need to know what harmonics are right now. Square wave uses odd harmonics, and that's the difference between those two sounds. Okay, then we have what's called the pulse width. This is when you use the square form, we can, okay, so imagine a square. I wish I had a visual of this. We can either make the square smaller like this, or we can make it wider like this. Okay, so that's what pulse width is. The more narrow we make the square, the more thin it sounds. So this would be a thin pulse wave, for example. Now the reason you would use pulse wave modulation is to create what's called wave interference. To create that phasey, chorusy sound. We could also do unique stuff like modulate this with something to make it move up and down. So the pulse wave goes like this. It kind of makes it wider and shorter. So we could do a lot of things with pulse width modulation. Let's just leave it in the middle for now, because we'll probably see if we could mess with it over here. I don't know if we can control that with the LFOs. Yeah, we can here, down here. All right, so nextly, we need to understand what sync is. Sync is, from what I understand, this oscillation modulating itself by itself. This is when we talk about frequency modulation. So let's just turn it on. Okay, so let's go back to a sawtooth here. It might be more evident. It's really hard to pick up if you're not a seasoned sound designer, but it just adds a little more harmonic content in this case. I rarely use sync and I rarely use frequency modulation. Next, we have the mixer. This is where, again, we balance out oscillator 2 and oscillator 1. So before we start balancing those out, let's go to oscillator 2. Oscillator 2, again, is another voice. It's like having two people in a room. We can make one voice sing kind of out of key and the other person sing kind of out of key, so they both sound different. And then combining those will create a very detuned, big sound. So that's what we can do with oscillators 1 and 2. Let's turn this on. So that thick, creamy sound, I'll say, is from what's called the tuning. So the tuning by default was not set to 0. It was set to like negative point something. Let's set it back to 0. And what we'll get now is a phasey sound. Okay, so it's because we have two of the same waveforms happening at the same exact time, and any small little difference in volume creates this like washy sound. Now what happens if we start changing the tune of oscillator 2? Now remember, what is stereo information? Stereo is the difference between your left and your right ear. If I play the same exact sound with the same exact tuning, the same exact volume in the left ear, and do that in my right ear, it actually, our brain makes it centered. Now, when we have a subtle difference of the thing in our left ear from our right ear, our brain creates a difference, and that's called the side information. So here we can make a sound more creamy or bigger. I don't know if we could pan inside of here. Oscillators 1 and 2, I don't think we can. But there's something called Unison, which uses that panning technique. Anyhow, we're just going to add oscillator 2 here to add that sound. And let's use the fine tune knob. And now we are basically creating sawteeth that are like slightly back to back. So instead of sawteeth stacking on top of each other, one's here and then one's here, like this. So now it's a more full sound because now we're filling in the in-between gaps with sound. And that's how you create these big super saw sounds, they're called. Now the only issue we have at this point is it's not a wide sound. Okay, that's why older synths, they would pair these with pedals and different outboard gear to make them wide. That's why the Juno chorus was so important. So, all right. Next, let's turn. So I could go through all these little things, but it will just confuse you guys most of the time. Low frequency means we're basically going to make oscillator 2 so low that it just wobbles like this. It's just very slow. You can't hear it. But what it will do is modulate the amplitude of oscillator A. So let's put this on low frequency mode just to see how low it can go. See how it's just like, okay, so it's so low that it's barely audible. Now what happens if I lower the frequency even further? It just becomes little clicks. Now if I up the frequency, we can kind of hear it. So what happens is if you have one sound that's really, really slow and another sound that's really fast, the slower thing moves the faster thing. It's called low frequency oscillation, and it can modulate oscillator 1. Okay, so what we can do is make this frequency so low that it's not audible. So let's switch it to a triangle wave. It's a little more easy on the ear. And we can make it so low that we can't even hear it. So if I turn on oscillator 1, now in this case, this wasn't powerful enough to modulate oscillator 1. We would have to use something like oscillator 2 under what's called the modulation area. So oscillator 2, we can modulate the frequency of oscillator 1, the pulse width of oscillator 1, or the filter. Let's do the frequency of oscillator 1. So this sound is moving so slow, we can tell it to do something and control something about oscillator 1. So let's do that. So if I move, this is called vibrato, by the way, if I change the pitch of a sound. Now, if I move the frequency, I want you guys to listen to how fast oscillator 2 sounds in the modulation. I'll exaggerate just so you guys can hear. Now, we don't need the oscillator 2 output as far as amplitude on for this effect to occur. So as I increase the frequency, okay, so that's how you can modulate, you know, a sound with what's called a low frequency oscillator. Now we have another oscillator, which is a third oscillator we can use to do that very function. Okay, so we don't need to set up oscillator 2 to play really low frequencies. That's only if we want that to drop it down in octaves that are barely audible. So in this case, we could use what's called an LFO, and that LFO can control different things here in the wheel mod area. So I could turn the LFO on, and then that will control. Now this is kind of confusing because it has noise and then the source mix, which is kind of weird. So let's control it, I guess, to make it, let's just see what it sounds like first. Okay, I see why. Okay, so this is kind of confusing, y'all. So I know this is not for beginners, but the mod wheel is another thing on your controller that controls different things. Let's put it that way. So what this synth is set up to do, if I move this controller on the MIDI controller, if I move this knob, okay, that wheel, I should say, if I move that wheel, it will control these things based on this wheel's amount. So think of this wheel like a mix level, and think of the source mix as choosing what we want to be the modulator for the destination. I'm giving you guys a lot of big words. If you want sound design from the ground up, like step by step, guiding you step by step, go to busyworksbeats.com/premium. I have a sound design course, and I go through literally the fundamentals of sound design, from understanding all the waveforms, the differences between each. I go over how to make your own drum kits. I go through really complex sound design. So go to busyworksbeats.com/premium. So what we're doing here is to control this LFO amount, because we want the vibrato on oscillator 1. We need to tell the mod wheel to have a mix level, basically, and the mod source will be the LFO. So we're assigning the LFO via the mod wheel to control the frequency 1's pitch or frequency 2's pitch, in this case if we activate oscillator 2, which I will in a second here. So let's turn up the mod wheels to create the vibrato. And now we can set the rate here to slow it down so that it's not so obvious. Let's activate oscillator 2. And let's detune the sound. And now we have a very big super saw type sound. Nextly, we want to talk about filters. So filters shape the harmonics of a sound. I really didn't define harmonics for this video because it would just take up way too much time. Harmonics are, you know, multiples of frequencies. So if I have a bass sitting at 100 hertz, the second harmonic would be 2 times 100. The third harmonic would be 3 times 100. The fourth harmonic would be 4 times 100, on and on and on. Harmonics are just multiples of a specific frequency. And what we can do is add different filter types to either remove or enhance the harmonics added to a sound. This is called the timbre of a sound. So by default, most filters are set to low pass filter. So if I lower this, we're now chiseling out the high frequencies of a sound. We're getting rid of the upper harmonics of a sound. And now we can use different envelopes to control this movement. So let's say I want the filter to be like this. I can tell this envelope to do that automatically every time I hit a key. So let's tell it to go up to a certain max value and then come back down the decay time. So it's going to go up, come down based on these knobs. And the sustain value is where I want it to rest by default. So we don't want that turned on. We want it to be whatever the minimum value is for the filter cutoff. Let's turn up resonance so we can hear the filter movement. Let's give it a little release so it doesn't just fade off into nothingness. And the envelope amount is the max value of where the filter cutoff moves. So again, based on the attack time, it's just like me moving this knob. If I go slow, it will mean the attack is slow. And then the decay time is how fast I turn it back down. So we're emulating human movement basically with this envelope. And now we can turn down the resonance. So now we were creating a brass tone. We could use sustain to, keep a tone there. And the amplitude envelope is the same exact thing except for volume. So we could just, in this case, we're going to keep it where it is. Now another tool in the Prophet series, and I have a Prophet 6 right here. This is my favorite synth as far as sound designing sounds. And then I have a Chord Chronos for everything else that's like sound design, but like real instruments as well. So those two combined are my favorite keyboards. And the Unison will do the same thing we did with Oscillator 2, which was duplicate the sound and then change the pitch a little bit. But it will do that across many voices, and it will make the sound even bigger. So you guys got to be careful here because it can be a little CPU heavy in some plugins. And also, I don't know if we could do this with polyphony. Sometimes Unison locks it down to monophonic, meaning we can only play one note at a time. So this might not allow us to play multiple notes once we have Unison enabled. So just keep that in mind. This is for like single note lines. We could detune it even further. I don't really hear much of a difference because we've added so much filtering and we already had a super soft sound, so it's not really, the ear can't pick up on the difference because we already designed that in the sound itself. So that doesn't really add much to this sound. Next we have an arpeggiator, which we do have on the Prophet 6. So the arpeggiator, I don't normally do this unless I'm designing bells. And then we could just set, we could synchronize it to our BPM of our DAW. And normally when I'm making bells, I'll show you guys how to make a bell pretty quickly with this. I'll do this for like 3 octaves in an upward pattern, just so I don't have to play notes over and over and over again with the MIDI. So that's pretty much it with the Prophet 5. Now Arturia takes it to another level, which is adding different effects onto the plugin. And also there's these secret little Easter egg type things here. Voice dispersion. So this would be for your Unison, I believe. The dispersion of the voices, meaning how widely panned they are, or the volume of each voice. Okay, so it says pitch. We have pulse width. So this looks like it's for the Unison mode, which I don't have turned on right now. So let's leave that as is. And let's go to the advanced tab. So here's where we can add things that aren't in the actual synth from retro time, but they've added these things inside to make it more modern. We have the effects here. So if we wanted to widen out the sound, we turn this up. Now normally you would not get this effect in the Prophet 5. And then we could add some reverb here to give it depth. And there's other distortions. There's time-based delays and different things. Let's do maybe tape echo. Okay, so now the sound is wider. Okay, so now you have your first brass type sound, and we're gonna move to a bell type sound before we move to a bass sound. So let's just play around on the keyboard. Now this sound specifically is being washed away by some of the reverb. So in this case, I would pull back the effects like chorus and reverb. And I'm not trying to go into the depths of everything here, but it's a pretty basic sound there. Okay, so next, let's show you guys how to quickly design some bells. For example, let's click up top with a template. Let's go back to default. I'm going to move faster now that we've explained every little thing. Okay, so usually for bells, we have a actually, bells can be polyphonic, so that doesn't matter. But for bells, we want the We're going to turn off oscillator 2. We want to start with something smoother, like a triangle wave, okay, which is on oscillator 2. Now, nextly, I'm going to turn on what's called the arpeggiator so that I don't have to go back to the MIDI and play a bunch of notes. Let's just put this on 3 octaves. Okay, let's start messing with the amp envelope to give it some release to feel like a bell. Bells don't have a sustain, they just have a decay curvature after you hit the bell to fade away of the sound. I don't know why the sound was that quiet. There we go, let's turn it back up. So we're pretty much done the bell, but let's start messing with the filter envelope here. Let's take off the keyboard following. And we want to give this a very quick decay curvature. And this creates the pluckiness of a bell. Okay, so it shapes the bell a little bit more. Nextly, we can use these polyphonic modulators here. So let's do a filter envelope over the pitch of 1 to create oscillator 1, and we're gonna create like a little plucky sound here. So let's give this a very fast decay curvature. So we can, by turning this up, I'm basically telling it the max value of the pitch to dive. So very quick decay curvature, we'll give that like a plucky sound. Now I wish we could take oscillator 2 out of filter 1. So in that case, I'll just up the cutoff so that it doesn't affect the sound, but we still get the filter movement. And we can also modulate oscillator 2 by oscillator 1 to create a really unique. So there's different wave types. Let's try this pulse width modulation here. And then we can change the frequency. Now we're in that bell territory. I think we get a vibe out of this part of the sound, the lower octave here. And again, we don't have to have this in key per se, but and then nextly we could modulate, let's do the mod wheel. Let's create that vibrato. Let's add some effects here, let's add some chorus. To widen it out, and let's add a little distortion. Let's try different styles here. Kind of like this sound. Switch this to a low pass though. Get rid of some of those highs. Okay, so now I'm going to try out the sound. I'm going to turn off the arpeggio, aider, I should say, and then play regular bell. Now, to be fair, this is a noisier bell because of that distortion. Normally, I wouldn't add distortion, but I like that tone for this specific sound. And also, too, I wouldn't add a pluck that fast. So I'd like to be creative with my sounds, but that's how you do it. Also, let's give this some sustain. So So our main thing now is like, why does the sound, I'll say stagnant, is because we got rid of that pitch envelope for the square. And now the other sound can be modulated. Let's also make this a higher octave. So to me, the sound is too low frequency. So I just raise this up. Now we have our own custom bell just like that. Okay, so I kind of sped through that. I understand that wasn't the easiest to follow along. Next, I said I would create a bass and then we'll wrap this. Let's go to default. Now, I don't use the Prophet 5 for bass sound design. I'd recommend something a little easier like a mini Moog for just achieving the bass thickness. But let's see what we could do with this sound here. So for a bass line, I'm trying to think of an easy way to do this. We need to program the MIDI. Let's just make it jump octaves here. And then we'll just have that repeat. Okay, so with bass, usually you want to have a pretty simple waveform like a sine wave or a triangle wave. We're going to use Oscillator 2, turn on the triangle mode. And then we will lower the octave here, -12 semitones. Let's turn up the volume so we can hear it. And really, before we start messing with stuff, let's go to the Advanced tab. Let's mess with the chorus to widen out the sound. Because most of the time, we don't want anything else on the bass. Basses are pretty simple. We don't want to add a bunch of stuff to a bass. Let's add Oscillator 1, see how it gets. Now to add bite to it, we could add that sawtooth, just to add that ear gripping effect. I wouldn't touch it beyond this point. That would be the extent. We could also mess with the Unison. As you guys hear, it's a very big sound. Now in that case, I wouldn't mess with Oscillator 1 as much. Unless we're going for like a UK type sound. Okay, so that's what Unison does, is it just multiplies out the sound. So this is how I would like the sound, and you just balance the mix and turn it up. It's pretty much what I would do for bass. Pretty simple. If you guys want to learn sound design, go to busyworksbeats.com/premium. I have a whole sound design course. I have multiple. One will guide you through the fundamentals, and one will go into more advanced stuff like building your own drum kit, for example, showing you how to build kicks, snares, hi-hats from scratch. Subscribe if you're new. Go to busyworksbeats.com/premium. Peace out, guys.